February 2026. Cuba has 15 to 20 days of crude oil reserves remaining. After that, the lights go out. Permanently. Washington announces new tariffs targeting any country that sells oil to Cuba. Moscow pledges necessary support. Beijing condemns the economic siege. Mexico suspends commercial shipments while promising humanitarian aid. Meanwhile in Havana, the blackouts stretch 26 hours straight, hospitals operate without medication, and food prices exceed monthly salaries by factors of 10. This isn't 1962, where superpowers negotiated over Cuba's head. This is 2026, where an island 90 miles from Miami becomes the testing ground for whether economic warfare can force regime change without invasion, and whether Russia and China will actually confront American dominance when the cost gets real. Let's trace how Cuba arrived at this precipice, and what happens when the countdown hits zero. January 3rd, 2026, 2 a.m., Caracas. Delta Force operators, backed by CIA intelligence, storm Nicolas Maduro's compound. Explosions light up northern Venezuela as US bombers suppress air defenses. Dozens die in the raid. Maduro gets photographed aboard USS Iwo Jima, blindfolded, soundproof headphones, bound for New York arraignment on narco-terrorism charges. Among the dead, 32 Cuban military and intelligence personnel. Because Cuba didn't just support Venezuela diplomatically, Cuba effectively ran Venezuela's security apparatus. 32,000 Cuban operatives embedded in Venezuelan intelligence, internal security, even Maduro's personal protection detail. When Delta Force captured Maduro, they killed Cuba's economic model. Here's why. Venezuela supplied Cuba with 46,500 barrels of oil per day before that raid. Subsidized crude at below-market rates, the arrangement that kept Cuban lights on since Hugo Chavez declared the two countries living in a sea of happiness back in 1999. Cuba sent troops, intelligence, and regime protection. Venezuela sent oil. That partnership terminated the moment Maduro got arrested. Mexico had been Cuba's secondary supplier, 17,000 barrels per day. Within weeks of the Venezuela operation, those shipments halted too, under pressure from Trump administration threats to weaponize USMCA renegotiation. Do the math. Cuba loses roughly 63,700 barrels daily. Cuba needs approximately 60,000 barrels per day just to maintain basic electricity. There's no margin, there's no backup plan, there's just the countdown clock. Cuba didn't just lose oil, it lost the revenue stream from reselling Venezuelan crude at market rates while paying subsidized prices, hard currency that financed food and medicine imports. That income? Gone. The military partnership anchoring Cuba's regional security posture? Dissolved. The assumption that great power patrons would seamlessly replace Venezuela if something went wrong? About to get tested. Venezuela-Cuba wasn't just an oil deal. It was the economic architecture that allowed Cuba's system to survive after Soviet subsidies ended. Between 1999 and 2013, Chavez supplied up to 100,000 barrels daily at heavily subsidized rates. Cuba provided the security expertise that kept Chavez, and later Maduro, in power against coup attempts, protests, and internal threats. Cuban operatives trained Venezuelan intelligence services, monitored military loyalty, protected the president personally. When Maduro faced his own survival crises, Cuban personnel were the regime's backbone. But here's what that partnership masked: structural economic decay. While Venezuelan oil kept the generators running, Cuba's domestic production collapsed. Sugar harvests that historically measured in millions of metric tons, down to 165,000 tons in 2024 to 25, real wages adjusted for inflation, down 96% since 2015, agricultural mechanization, farmers switching from tractors back to oxen, which then get stolen for food because people are starving. The dependency created a fatal vulnerability. When your economy runs on someone else's oil like a patient runs on an IV drip, you don't diversify, you don't reform, you don't build resilience, you assume the drip continues, because it always has. Until January 3rd, when someone cut the line. This is the Venezuela lesson applied to Cuba. Patron-client relationships work until the patron implodes or gets regime changed by a superpower. Then your model dies too. Cuba didn't have to prepare for this scenario because for 25 years, it never happened. Now it's happening in real time, and there are 15 days of reserves left. January 29th, 2026. One day before Secretary of State Marco Rubio testifies to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about Cuba policy, President Trump signs Executive Order 14,380. The mechanics. The Commerce and State Departments identify which countries sell oil to Cuba. The President sets tariff rates on goods from those countries. If shipments continue, tariffs escalate. The legal justification invokes the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, declaring Cuba an unusual and extraordinary threat to US national security. The stated reasons. Cuba hosts Russia's largest overseas signals intelligence facility at Lords, focused on intercepting US communications. Cuba provides safe haven for Hamas and Hezbollah. Cuba aligns with Russia, China, and Iran. Cuba persecutes political opponents, denies free speech, spreads communist ideology across the hemisphere. But listen to Rubio's Senate testimony on January 28th. He acknowledges explicitly, regime change is the goal. The 1996 Helms-Burton Act codifies the embargo until Cuba's government changes. Title III, activated by Trump in 2019 after 20 years dormant, allows US nationals to sue Cuban entities for properties expropriated after 1959. The Supreme Court is hearing cases on whether Cuban government entities lose sovereign immunity, creating pathways to seize Cuban assets globally if regime change succeeds. This isn't about human rights accountability, it's about economic siege as regime change doctrine. Mexico feels the pressure immediately. Republican lawmakers Carlos Gimenez, Mario Diaz-Balart, Maria Elvira Salazar explicitly threatened to weaponize USMCA renegotiation if Mexico keeps selling oil to Cuba. Trump personally requests President Claudia Sheinbaum suspend shipments. Sheinbaum navigates an impossible tightrope. Her leftist orientation demands solidarity with Cuba, but Mexican economic survival depends on avoiding tariffs that would devastate exports. Her compromise, commercial oil sales halted under pressure, humanitarian assistance, food and goods via Mexican Navy, pledged and delivered. Oil shipments for humanitarian reasons remain under diplomatic negotiation. The distinction matters legally, but functionally, Cuba's losing those 17,000 barrels per day. The international community votes 165 to 7 against the embargo at the UN General Assembly. International law scholars call secondary sanctions, tariffs on third countries for their independent transactions, violations of sovereignty. The US frames it as accountability for a regime that tortures dissidents and imprisons 650 political prisoners from July 2021 protests. Washington turned oil into a choke point. Now the question, who's willing to break the blockade and who just makes promises while satellites track empty tanker routes? Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov calls the US pressure unacceptable, pledges necessary political and material support, condemns Executive Order 14,380 as illegal under the UN Charter. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova frames this as Washington's maximum pressure strategy, violating international law. Here's what they're actually doing. Rosneft loaded 100,000 tons of crude onto the academic Gubkin in January, expected mid-February arrival, at Cuba's Matanzas terminal. 100,000 tons translates to roughly 20 days of consumption at current rates. That buys time. It doesn't solve the crisis, and the volumes are declining. Russia sent 600,000 tons in 2022, 200,000 in 2023, 100,000 in 2024. Russia's constrained by Ukraine war resource demands, sanctions targeting its shadow fleet, and limited capacity for major Caribbean commitments. Moscow maintains the Lords Intelligence Facility, demonstrating global reach, but won't risk direct US confrontation over Cuba. Signaling presence is one thing. Sustaining a besieged economy 90 miles from Florida is another. Beijing condemns the blockade, pledges as much support as possible, votes with the 165-nation majority against the embargo. China frames this as principled opposition to unilateral coercive measures violating sovereignty. What's missing? Confirmed oil shipments. China's investing in Cuban infrastructure, holding diplomatic meetings, signaling great power status. But Chinese tankers aren't sailing for Havana. Beijing won't challenge US hemispheric dominance for Cuba when the risks include economic retaliation that could cascade through China's core interests. The telling silence. Rhetoric costs nothing. Crude oil deliveries cost real money and carry real consequences. That gap defines great power solidarity. Scheinbaum's caught between revolutionary solidarity, her political base expects support for Cuba, and economic survival. Pemex supplies only 3% of crude exports to Cuba, minimal economically, massive politically. The reality, if Scheinbaum caves completely, Cuba hits zero in 15 to 20 days. If she defies Trump, Mexico risks tariffs dwarfing Cuba's strategic importance. So she splits the difference. Humanitarian aid flows, commercial sales stop, and diplomatic negotiations continue while the clock ticks. Mexico's the only realistic near-term supplier with proximity and capacity, and Washington knows it. Promises are cheap. Oil deliveries get tracked by satellite. While diplomats talk, Cuba's reserves drain. Here's what that looks like on the ground. 26 hours of blackouts consecutively in many regions. The Antonio Guterres thermoelectric plant offline, eliminating 200 megawatts. National deficit hits 75% of demand during peak hours. Kepler energy analyst Victoria Grabenvoger, Cuba can function for 15 to 20 days at current consumption. After that, energy collapse. No electricity means no water pumping. Artemisa province, 83% water access reduction. Havana, 80%. No refrigeration means food spoilage. No hospital equipment, no public transport. The peso lost 10% in 3 weeks as of early February, down 88% since 2020. Informal exchange rate, 405 pesos per dollar versus the official 24. Food prices in early 2026. Potatoes 450 pesos per pound, onions 380, beans 500, meat 1,000. A modest grocery purchase, 10,300 pesos. Average state worker salary, 6,830 pesos monthly. Teachers, 5,495. Healthcare workers, 6,562. A Cuban doctor earning 4,500 pesos, roughly $16 at informal rates, cannot afford rice, chicken, toothpaste. Real wages today, 67% of 1989 levels. Between 2015 and 2022, consumer prices increased 24-fold while real wages fell 96%. Inflation running 20 to 32% monthly for 20 consecutive months. Triple epidemic, dengue, Oropouche virus, 626 confirmed cases, 76 developing Guillain-Barré syndrome, 25 with encephalitis, and chikungunya, 38,938 cases, 33 deaths in 1 week in late 2025, 21 of them minors. Hospitals lack diagnostic reagents, antibiotics, basic supplies. Patients sent home to rest without treatment because medications don't exist. The Medilip company expands plant-based syrups, oregano, eucalyptus, aloe vera, not because they work, but because there's nothing else. A 69-year-old housekeeper, her 10-minute commute now takes 4 hours round trip due to transportation collapse, costs consuming her wages. A 32-year-old woman, survival nothing else. Neither government offers hope. Taxi drivers at Digital Q position 2,900, estimating 2 months to reach the front for fuel, sold in dollars at inflated prices. This is what maximum pressure looks like in practice. While Washington, Moscow and Beijing play chess, Cubans count hours of darkness. Now the question, can the regime survive what's coming? President Miguel Díaz-Canel's messaging, defiant, uncompromising, revolutionary. Patria o muerte, we will never surrender. Dialogue possible on equal terms, with respect, without preconditions, but dialogue cannot occur under pressure. Military readiness rhetoric, war of the entire people exercises, National Defense Day invoking the cost imperialism would pay for attacking Cuba. References to the 32 Cubans killed fighting US forces in Venezuela. But the constraints tell a different story. Cuban military declined from 300,000 personnel to 60,000 during earlier crises, training suspended due to resource shortages, agriculture switching from tractors to oxen, which get stolen for food, tourism down 72% through April 2025, sugar production, 165,000 tons versus historical millions. The Economic Commission for Latin America forecasts Cuba's GDP shrinking 1.5% in 2025, barely any growth in 2026, second worst in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. The cohesion question. Does the GAESA military apparatus maintain elite unity when they can't provision their own supporters? Do factions emerge around negotiation versus resistance strategies? 650 political prisoners still jailed from 2021 protests. Repression capacity intact but public exhaustion deepening. Trump's strategy remains ambiguous. Public messaging. Cuba is ready to fall. Going down for the count. I don't think we need any action. Also, I think we're going to make a deal with Cuba, no terms specified. Politico reports naval blockade under discussion. Energy as chokehold to kill the regime. The regime says it won't surrender. Washington says collapse is inevitable. Neither claim tells you what happens in the next 30 days. Scenario 1. Regime negotiation. Russia, China or Mexico stabilize minimal oil supply, just enough to prevent total collapse. Regime accepts partial reforms, economic liberalization, political prisoner releases, foreign policy distancing from Russia to secure sanctions relief. Risk. Hardliners view any concession as existential. Trump and Rubio demand regime change, not reform. Scenario 2. Prolonged deterioration. International support provides just enough to prevent total failure, but not restoration. Crisis becomes permanent condition, 12-hour blackouts, severe scarcity, security apparatus maintains control. Population lacks organization for sustained uprising. Special period 2.0, indefinite duration. Scenario 3, internal fracture. Oil runs out completely, services collapse, elite unity breaks when GAESA can't feed its own. Military coup, reformist transition, or negotiated exit depending on whether factions see survival in change versus doubling down. Scenario 4, external intervention. Naval blockade to halt all oil imports. Supreme Court ruling potentially jeopardizing IEEPA. Authority forces military option. Russian and Chinese response unknown. Unlikely but not impossible if humanitarian catastrophe creates political pressure for rescue operation. Scenario 5. Unexpected stabilization. Russia or China dramatically increase support as multipolarity demonstration. Trump accepts face-saving deal. Venezuelan transition government restores limited flows. Requires all major actors shifting positions simultaneously. 5 scenarios, 1 countdown, 15 to 20 days of oil. Cuba validates what Venezuela proved. Economic models built on external subsidies collapse when the patron disappears. Difference. Venezuela had oil infrastructure to reactivate post-Maduro. Cuba has nothing but hope for external rescue. Russia and China pledge solidarity but won't risk direct confrontation with the US in its sphere of influence. Symbolic shipments buy time, don't change trajectories. Multipolar world order means rhetorical support and limited material aid, not decisive intervention. This isn't abstract geopolitics. It's 11 million people facing blackouts, hunger, disease outbreaks, system collapse while great powers maneuver. The oil countdown doesn't care about ideology. It cares about barrels per day. Right now, the math doesn't work. By March 2026, we'll know whether Cuba found a lifeline, negotiated an exit, collapsed into chaos, or something none of the scenario planners predicted. The Venezuela operation that captured Maduro on January 3rd might have signed Cuba's death warrant, or it might force the regime change Washington's pursued for 65 years, or it might trigger the great power confrontation everyone tried to avoid. It's February 2026. Cuba has 15 to 20 days of oil left. The countdown continues. The verdict isn't in yet, but the clock is running. This is the story YouTube's algorithm doesn't naturally promote. Too long, too complex, too much context required. If you made it this far, hit like to signal it's worth the time investment. Subscribe for the next chapter because this crisis isn't over. By March,